Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a cloud solutions architect specializing in management technologies. Today's session will be part one of a new series that I'm doing to focus specifically on the comparing and contrasting, I guess, ConfigMgr and Intune. This is not a session intended to say, hey, ConfigMgr is better than Intune, Intune is better than ConfigMgr. No, not at all. These are two separate products that you can use independently, you can use complementary, whatever. But some of the concepts between these two products, while they're similar, they are different. And that's kind of the goal of this series of sessions, is to highlight those different components, the similarities, the differences, etc. And to do that really at a 30,000 foot, 10,000 foot view level, not really digging into the nitty-gritty details of some of this, but just trying to present the concepts to help with kind of the learning, the comparison, whatever the case. So part one will focus on collections versus groups. And so for this, since I said the focus of this kind of session is going to be 30,000 foot, 10,000 foot view, there are definitely sessions that I've done that will get into more of the fine detail about some of these topics. Specifically, I'm just in the middle of a series focused on groups that really is detailing how you can work with groups in Intune and also some of the tie-ins there. So that's going to be, I'm on part 4 of that session as of this recording. Probably will be at least a 6-part, maybe 7-part series. So that's an example where if you do want to dig deeply, you can, right, on some of the group discussion and so on. Anyway, enough about that. Let's get going in this one, part 1. Not sure how many sessions or sections I will have in this concepts series, but this is part 1, so let's get started. Right, so here is our agenda. We'll follow this kind of agenda in general for sessions like this. Start off with what are collections and Entra ID groups? Why do we care about them? Do a little bit of concepts kind of sharing between and dig into some of the detail. And as you look at some of the detail that I'm going to go into, again, very high level. If you want to get into the specifics, that's where I'm doing the broader, longer groups sessions that I mentioned. Right, so let's get into it. So what are collections and Entra ID groups? Well, both collections and Entra ID groups organize resources. Those resources can be either users or devices, not both. So you can't have a collection that contains both users and devices. You can't have an Entra ID group that contains both users and devices, right? So both collections and Entra ID groups are generally used for deployment targeting. Now that could be multiple types of deployments. It could be applications, could be configurations, could be security focused, could be whatever, right? But that's the goal, is to build a discrete functional unit that you can then use in targeting, right? And there's more that we can talk about there, but in general, that's what these are. Why do we care? Well, collections and Entra ID groups both will bring structure to your environment where you can plan how you want to roll forward with your deployments in a prescribed way, right? Using single collections, single Entra ID groups, multiple collections, multiple Entra ID groups, how you integrate those together and some of the options you have to build these to get exactly the format you want, the result that you want. We'll talk more about that as we go along. So conceptually, what are collections and Entra ID groups, and how do they differ? Well, very high level, right? Collections come directly from config manager. Another way to say that, collections are a core component of config manager. They are fully owned, fully managed by the config manager product, and accordingly, the config manager product team. So another way to say that too is if for some reason there's something identified in collections that needs to be updated, needs to change, needs to be modified, then the config manager product team has total and full capability to actually make that change. Contrast that to groups, right? Groups are a component not of Intune, but of Entra ID. They are leveraged by Intune, but not owned by Intune. So that makes it a little bit different. So if there's some sort of need that needs to change related to groups, Intune does not have, the Intune product team does not have the direct ability to implement those changes because Entra ID owns those groups, right? Now, there are examples where we need to do something specific for our management needs in Intune that groups don't do so well, right? Or don't support. And so we, the Intune product team, will implement the solution for that in Intune. So a good example coming up is the concept of filters, right? Filters is something that the Intune product team introduced for a specific need to address a challenge with groups that was more specific to Intune use cases. And so that is owned by Intune and does work alongside groups, but it's not a group thing, it's an Intune thing. More on that in a minute as we go forward, but just wanted to share that. Okay, so little table here to try to, again, draw some kind of parallels between collections and Entra ID groups. So in terms of availability, authority, right? Collections are owned by config manager, right? Totally. Groups are owned by, I just realized that I should have made this collections. I put config manager. Sorry, that's supposed to be collections. So put that in your mind as you're looking at this. So in terms of authority, the collections are totally owned by config manager. Entra ID groups totally owned by the Entra ID group, right? Intune makes use of them. In terms of membership, the collections can have users or devices, not both, right? Entra ID groups can have users or devices, not both, right? There are different types of collections. That bugs me. I'm going to go make a change real quick. Stand by. Okay, and with the magic of PowerPoint, I changed the header. That was bugging me. So with, you can have different types of collections. You can have dynamic collections. You can have direct collections. There's a couple of more types of collections you can actually build. With Entra ID groups, you can do similar, right? You have assigned, that's the name there for Entra ID groups versus direct. You can do dynamic groups as well, right? That's really the two big categories for groups. There's nothing else about groups that you can create in the UI. If we look at the criteria for collections, then we have a whole slew of attributes, a ton of inventory, right? Tons of default options and user extensible options, and really the sky's the limit with collections. With groups, yeah, you have attributes and you have inventory too, but the options are less, right? Doesn't mean that you can't do what you generally need. With groups, you can, but it oftentimes is thinking a little bit about how we want to accomplish it, what we exactly need to do in doing that, and exploring all options in certain cases, and more to come on that. In terms of how we use collections versus groups, so for Config Manager Collections, it's all about deployments, being able to also do security-related things, role-based access, maintenance windows, power management, etc., variables and such, right? And then with Entra ID groups, you have the same idea. Deployment and security for sure would be things that you would use Entra ID groups for. Some of the additional mechanisms don't even really exist in Intune, maintenance windows and power management and such, right? I suppose you could do power management through policies and such, but you get the idea, right? Okay, so the big umbrella deployment, that's where you would use collections and Entra ID groups all up. And then populated by, so that's kind of tying back into the types, right? So you can populate the collections by direct membership rules, dynamic membership rules. You can populate Entra ID groups by assigned membership rules, dynamic membership rules. And there's also this thing called Config Manager Cloud Sync, right? Let me talk about that. More detail on that coming up. Let me talk about that for a second. The idea in general, if you can do something natively, it's better to do that thing natively. So always ask, if you need to build a group, look at ways to do it using the native options. Even if you need to go into kind of a different, other than the UI, outside the box thinking, if we can get it done natively, that's better than doing so by connecting to another product, such as Config Manager. So Config Manager Cloud Sync it's actually something that's really good, right? So don't shy away from it if you need to use it, but if you can get it done natively, that's definitely preferred, right? But if you do need Config Manager Cloud Sync, absolutely use it. More on that in a minute on how it looks and how it would work. Again, high level, right? But that's a difference. And then membership. So there's the concept with collections of limiting the membership, right? More on this specifically in a minute, but the idea is that when you build your new collection, you will link it to a pre-existing collection. Then the membership that would be in your new collection can be limited only to the members that are in that linked collection, right? Okay. The similar concept in groups would be filters, right? Primarily. You could maybe say that nesting groups maybe is in that category too. Not exactly, right? Filters are the more direct parallel. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then finally, updating. Can you update Config Manager collections? Yes, right? Can you do it manually? Yes. Can you schedule when those collections update? Yes, right? Absolutely. For Entra ID groups, do those Entra ID groups update themselves? Absolutely, right? Dynamic updates, 100% works with Entra ID. Can you schedule when those happen yourself? No, you cannot, right? It's built in to Entra ID when that happens. And the ramifications of that will maybe start to come clear when we talk about filters in a minute, right? Can you manually trigger a group to synchronize and update? No, right? That's totally controlled by Entra ID. Intune leverages groups and such. With filters, as we'll talk about in a minute, this is one of the reasons filters came about, is because of the lack of control that Intune admins have over groups and how they are calculated and such, and some of the needs that they have. More on that again in a minute, right, as we get to it. Okay, so let's start to dig into this a bit more, again, staying at the 30,000, 10,000 foot view, not really getting granular right now. So there are sessions that I've done that will get into some of the granular stuff we're talking about. Maybe not all of it, but some of it, right? So here, the basics. Config Manager collections versus groups. So we have our Config Manager collection. You see it, just the properties window. We'll see the different options where you can specify your membership rules, dynamic membership rules, direct membership rules, more, whatever, where you can get into the power management options and the maintenance windows and collection variables you can sync down. Here's cloud sync, whatever. Here's where we have our limiting collection and so on. So a lot of controls are built into collections and so forth. Here are our groups, the same configuration window, if you will, in Entra ID, name of the group, whether you want to allow this group to have roles assigned to it. So kind of the RBAC world, security world, whatever. What kind of membership you're going to have, either assigned or dynamic. And then you would have different options under here, depending, right? If it's a dynamic group, then you need to specify the criteria for that dynamic recalculation. You don't see anything here about maintenance windows because there are no maintenance windows in Intune, right? And groups wouldn't probably have the maintenance window on it anyway, since Intune doesn't own groups. You don't see anything about power management here, right? On the group level, you could accomplish some power management through Intune, just a different mechanism to do so, right? And so forth, right? So just a quick comparison, some similarities for sure for building this out, some differences for sure in what you can build out, right, in this area. All right, so here, parameters and operators. So if we're building a collection, you have a huge list of parameters that you can choose from to build that collection membership. You compare that to the parameters and operators available for groups, and it's a much smaller list. So let's just say it out the gate, right? Are there things that you can far more easily build with Config Manager collections than there are with Entra ID groups? The answer is yes, absolutely, right? The sky is the limit. If you need to build something in a collection, you can build it. If you need to build something in an Entra ID group and you look only at the UI, you will think, there's some things that I can't so easily do here, right? As you dig deeper into the Entra ID groups, then you realize, I just need to think about doing this differently. It's not that I can't do it. It's that I might need to think through how I'm going to get it done a bit differently, right? And so here is where, as administrators that come from the Config Manager world, first approach Intune and they see the differences in group structure and collection structure, then one of the things they might choose to do, at least at first, is use Config Manager collection to Entra ID group synchronization. Talk about that more in another slide. And that's simply because they can take their existing skills and knowledge and comfort level about Config Manager collections, translate that over to Entra ID groups pretty easily. But again, using that approach kind of keeps an anchor back to another product, which creates another dependency. And if you can do it natively with Entra ID groups, that's always the better option, right? So it's there. You'll see it on a slide coming up. And you see the difference in the UI in terms of what you have at your fingertips to build some of these things, right? But you can get the job done with groups natively, very similar to the way you can collections, but you just might have to think through it a bit. Okay, the text box. So this is starting to get into that area of beyond what meets the eye, perhaps, right? So whenever you go into the UI of Config Manager and you use that UI to build a collection, that collection ultimately is built sorry, I said that wrong. When you go into the ConfigMgr UI and you choose the various options from the dropdown, what happens in the background is a WQL query is created, right? You can write that query yourself if you want to, but ConfigMgr will translate your UI choices into that WQL collection, a statement, sorry. You can see that here, right? Well, similarly, if you have a need to build a particularly complex expression into your group, or have certain needs that you need to address with your groups, right? Sometimes the only way to do that is to use the text box. So the text box is the equivalent of where you would actually put in your query, right? It's not a query in this format, meaning it doesn't use WQL. There's a specific format for this, but it gives you the power to do things beyond the UI, right? So starting to get to that thinking about here's what the UI offers, but I need to do this thing that I don't clearly see a pathway to get done in the UI. Can I do that? The answer is yes, you can do that, right? It may make you think differently about how you approach it. The text box is one of those tools to help you approach building your group in a way that you need to build that group, right? There's a set of criteria that will force you into the text box, right? I list them, and you may prefer to be in the text box just because of what it gives you and as you get comfortable and so forth, right? But if you want to do any of these 5 things, then you have to be in the text box format, right? I'm not going to dig into this further here. So I mentioned there's a series that I'm doing on groups and Entra ID and Intune, right? This is session 3. So I just finished session 3 focusing on the text box and a lot of examples of queries you can build with the text box. So if you want to see more about that, take a look at that session. We will leave it here at this high level and move on. Okay, filters. So this is another one that I need to get to in the, as of now, I haven't done it, but I anticipate it will be session 5 in my group series, where I will talk about filters specifically, right? At the high level, let me start by, on the left-hand side, there is the CM limiting collection option, where you specify, basically, when you create a new collection, you have to define a limiting collection. Another words of saying that is a higher level collection that you want yours to be linked to. And when you link to that higher level collection, to the limiting collection, what that means is the membership of your new collection can be all of, if you want it to be, the membership of the limited collection, but can be less than that if you choose for it to be based on criteria. It can never be more than the membership of your limiting collection. So it's either, the limiting collection is your starting point and then can get more refined as you build your criteria in. That's the same as filters, right? Let me give you an example of where filters really came to be, right? And as we use this example, again, filters is purely an Intune construction. If you go look at Entra ID groups, you will see absolutely no reference to filters at all, right? If you go ask an Entra ID engineer, they likely will have no idea what you mean by filters. It is 100% built by the Intune product team and works as an overlay on your groups. A good example to start thinking about this: why did we build filters? So a customer I worked with for years was approaching Intune, and they had a series of cash register devices that they had configured and needed to put device restrictions on. And they were various OS types, Windows, Android, iOS, whatever. And as they were building that in Intune, they configured all of the profiles they needed, whatever, targeted them accordingly, and said, okay, is it working? Oh, look, yeah, it worked. But wait a minute. Hey, this time it worked in 5 minutes. This next time it took an hour. This next time it took 2 hours. What's going on here? We can't wait for this. We need this configuration set to apply immediately to these newly built imaged cash registers, right? Before they are touched by a user, we need to know that they are locked down, that these restrictions are applied, so we can't wait for this variable amount of time to be able to get this done. So Microsoft, what's wrong with your group structure? Well, the answer to this is that there's nothing wrong with the group structure, right? As we mentioned before, there's no way that you as an IT person can force an Entra ID group to update. You can't schedule when that happens. And so knowing that, and knowing that in scenarios like what I described, and there are others, that our customers needed to have that much more rapid ability to deploy certain configurations, we came up with filters. And the solution to that scenario that I gave to my customers was to say, okay, I get it. The reason you're having this problem is because you created dynamic groups that you then want to apply this configuration to. And conceptually, that works just fine. The problem is that you can't control when those dynamic groups will update. And so if you have brand new machines that you're imaging and you want to put these restrictions onto, you have to wait for those dynamic groups to get recalculated so that the system knows apply these configurations to these new machines, right? It works, but it's not optimal. So instead, right, one of the things that we know is that when you enroll a new device into Intune, which happens whenever you're doing autopilot or Apple Business Manager provisioning of a device or whatever, right? The first place that a new device will show up is in the all devices group, right? That happens almost immediately. There's no delay. It's going to get there right away as soon as it's enrolled. Knowing that if you instead, in this scenario, were to target your restrictions to all devices, then you would get that applied instantly. And they did that, and it worked. But then the next problem comes in. Okay, Steve, but that works, but we don't want this applied to all devices, just the newly imaged devices. And then enters filters, right? So now let's look at the right-hand side of the screen. So in this scenario, we could, in this sample scenario, we can target all devices, but we know that we don't want the configuration to actually go to all devices. So we will build a filter in Intune. In my example here, I'm just using enrollment profile name, which could apply to an autopilot scenario, could apply to an Apple Business Manager scenario, whatever, right? And so by using the enrollment profile name, now we are actually not targeting all devices. We're filtering this list of maybe, say, 10,000 devices of all devices, maybe to down to 150 devices or 500 devices. So the result is the configuration you target to all devices and then apply this filter ends up getting applied only to the devices that are provisioned with the enrollment profile name in autopilot, right? And that's how it works. You could do that with all users and filter with the device management type filter and get down to a managed or an unmanaged device. You could do that. You don't have to start with all devices or all users. You can have another group that you want to filter. Maybe you have all kiosk Windows devices in the US and employ a filter for your device category. And you say, oh, well, actually what I want is all of the ones that reside in the Eastern region, right? Lots of things that you could do with this. It's an Intune construct. If you want to know more about filters in more detail, tune in for, I think, session 6 on my group series that I'm building. But high level, that's the comparison contrast. Limiting collections, the equivalent over here is filters. Okay, then we have Entra ID group sync. So collection to Entra ID group sync. Again, you have this in your tool belt. So if there's something that you need to build a collection for, but you want to have an equivalent group in Entra ID, that's why we have this cloud sync option, right? Where you can actually look at your Azure AD groups, Entra ID groups, and say, okay, I want the membership of this collection to actually be copied over and replicated to this Azure AD Entra ID group. You can do that. The only requirement really is that it be an assigned group, because what's going to happen behind the scenes is ConfigMgr is going to leverage code to go keep that group in Azure AD in sync with itself. The other requirement is, in order for a device to show up in the Entra ID group, it has to exist in Entra ID, Azure AD. So if it doesn't exist there, but it does exist in ConfigMgr, then you're not going to get that device replicated over. So conceptually, it's possible that if you have 1,000 devices in ConfigMgr collection, but only 950 of those are in Entra ID, your collection will be 1,000, your Entra ID group will be 950, right? Okay, so there's an existing session where I talk about and go into detail about cloud sync. So if you want more on that, then look up that session, but that's the high level for it. And the last thing that I'll mention, and this is again beyond what meets the eye in the UI of Intune and groups and such, would be programmatic, right? Just like there's ways in ConfigMgr to go in and programmatically work on pretty much any aspect of ConfigMgr, but certainly collections, there's ways to go in programmatically and work with groups, right? The way to do that is with Graph API. I'm not going to go into detail about Graph API here, except to say that it is an option. You can implement Graph API in a number of ways. It's a PowerShell-driven thing. You can use it with Power Apps. You can use automation tools, Power Automate, Orchestrator, Azure Automation, etc. Lots of ways that you can do it. And this is why I say, when you approach looking at how you construct your groups, know that there are options beyond just what you see in the UI and just what meets the eye, right? Very often we can use native mechanisms to build your Azure AD groups, your Entra ID groups, and the result is actually better and more favorable than maybe linking to ConfigMgr with Cloud Sync, right? Use all of the options in your tool belt. Prefer the one that is a modern approach if you can, but know that you have all of those options available. And so that's where I'm going to wrap the session today. We'll have more of these as we go along in the series, looking at different aspects between ConfigMgr and Intune. Until then, have a good day. We'll see you next time.